hurled from a cliff into the river below. A cowboy dove after her and gave her shelter. The rope was still in my hand when she went over. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I had 40 feet of good grass rope coiled over my shoulder, and I was 10 yards up the bank watching a band of crows move a stolen remuda across the shallows when the whole ledge under that woman just gave. Limestone. Crumbles like sugar in a hard rain, and we'd had 3 days of hard rain before that morning cleared off. She was standing on an overhang above the chute. I saw her the second before it happened, saw her weight shift, and then the shelf split clean from the bluff and she was gone with it, off the edge and into the white water 30 feet below. I don't remember dropping the rope. I don't remember the jump. What I remember is the cold, like hitting a wall built of cold, and then nothing but water and the sound the river makes when you're inside it, which is no sound at all, just a pressure you feel in your teeth. My name is Cal Dunmore. I was 43 years old that fall, working stock for a man named Aldous Prest who ran cattle up in the Wind River Range. I'd been with Prest 11 years, which was longer than I'd been anywhere since I left Missouri at 17 with $6 and a bad idea. I was not, by any reasonable accounting, a man who made impulsive decisions. I ate the same breakfast most mornings. I sharpened the same knife. I'd slept in a bedroll on hard ground, so long my body had forgotten what a mattress was. I don't tell you this to make myself out to be dull. I tell you so you understand that when I went off that cliff, it wasn't brave. It was the only thing there was to do. I found her on a gravel bar 40 yards downstream, half out of the water, fighting the current with one arm. The other arm, I'd learn later, had gone into the rocks on the way down and was broken above the elbow. She was fighting one-armed and losing it, and the river wanted her back. I got my hands under her arms and pulled. She fought me, I'll say that first, and I'll say it plainly. Even half-drowned and broken, that woman fought. She got her good elbow up and caught me across the jaw hard enough to ring my ears. I held on. I'd been kicked by horses and gored once by a mean bull, and if there is a lesson in those things, it is just to hold on. And I held on, and I dragged her up the bank and onto the flat mud above the high water line, and I sat there with her across my lap in the November cold. Both of us soaked through, and she said something in Crow I didn't understand. I said, "You're all right." She said something else in Crow. I said, "You're all right," again, which was the only thing I had. She stopped fighting then, not because she believed me and not because she trusted me. I think she just ran out of the energy to fight. She lay there breathing, and I felt the arm and knew it was bad and pulled my coat off and put it over her and looked up at the bluff she'd fallen from, which was a long way up, and thought, nobody saw that. Nobody knows where I am. This is going to take a while. Her name was Lena. At least that's what she told me 3 days later when she had enough English to tell me anything. She had other names, a Crow name I couldn't pronounce right until she corrected me enough times that I got somewhere close. But she said Lena because she'd had a friend once, she said, a missionary woman, and that woman had called her that. I asked if she liked the name. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything seriously, and said it depended on who was saying it. I'm telling this out of order. I do that. It's how I remember things, not in a straight line, but in the pieces that matter. The pieces that matter. The way she looked at me the first time she was really conscious, 2 days after the river. I'd splinted the arm with 2 straight sticks and what was left of my spare shirt, and I'd built a shelter in a cut bank half a mile up from where I pulled her out, and I'd managed a fire and found the saddlebags where I'd left my horse tied in the trees. My horse, who had more sense than I did, had not followed me off the cliff, and she woke up and looked at me across the fire and didn't flinch and didn't speak. Just looked. Most people, when they wake up in a strange place hurt, their eyes go wide and they panic. Hers didn't. She took in the shelter and the fire and the splint on her arm and me in that order, and then she closed her eyes again. Not scared, just gathering information. The way she ate. I gave her hardtack and dried venison from the bags, and she ate the way a person eats who knows there might not be more. Carefully, with attention, not wasting anything. The way she pointed at the arm and said something in Crow, and I said, broken. And she nodded like that was a reasonable and manageable piece of news. It took us 4 days to get off that river and back to Prest's winter camp. 4 days because I had one horse and she could not ride alone with the arm the way it was, and so we rode double and moved slow. The first day she didn't speak. The second day she asked, in English that surprised me, how long until camp. I told her a day and a half. She nodded. Third morning she woke before me. She always woke before me, every day I ever knew her, and had the fire stoked and the coffee on from the grounds I'd had in the bag, and she was sitting with her good arm around her knees watching the hills go yellow with the sun. I said, "You should be resting." She said, "I have rested." I said, "The arm." She said, "The arm is broken. It will heal or it will not. Sitting still does not help it either way." I didn't have an answer to that, so I poured the coffee. Aldous Prest was not a man who welcomed complications. He was 60 years old and had been running cattle in the Wind River since before the war, and the things he wanted from his life were in good order, and a cook who didn't burn the beans and men who did the job without requiring explanations. He looked at me and Lena riding double into camp on the 4th afternoon, and he looked at the splinted arm, and he looked at me again, and he said, "Explain this briefly." I explained it. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "Crow." I said, "Yes." He said, "Any of her people know where she is?" I said I didn't know. The band I'd seen moving the remuda, I didn't know if she'd been with them or separate. I didn't know what she'd been doing on that overhang. Prest pulled at his mustache, which he did when he was working something out. He said, "She can stay in the tack room till the arm heals. After that she goes." He said it loud enough for her to hear. She was still on the horse, waiting, and she heard it, and she looked at him with those level eyes of hers and didn't say anything. I said, "That's fair." She stayed 5 months. The tack room was 12 by 14 with a potbelly stove and a bunk the hands used when they pulled night duty on the cattle. It was not comfortable, and it was not warm, and the smell of leather and neatsfoot oil and horse sweat was so thick you wore it in your clothes. She didn't complain. She had her own sense of what was adequate, and it was Spartan and hard-won. I brought her meals the first week while the arm was bad, and she thanked me once formally and then never again, because I think she understood that thanks repeated become noise. Instead she started, when she could manage it one-handed, to help with the cooking. The cook was a man named Burl Hughes who weighed 260 pounds and had opinions about his kitchen, and the first time Lena walked in and started doing something to his stew, I expected a fight. What I got was Burl watching her with his big arms crossed and then tasting what she'd added, some dried things she'd had in a pouch in her dress, things I didn't know the names of, and Burl said, "Well," which was as close to high praise as Burl got about food. The arm healed crooked. She never said anything about it, but I saw her flex the fingers in the evenings, testing what worked and what didn't with a methodical patience that was hard to look at. She had full use of her hand, but the arm sat at a slight angle from the break, and if it hurt, and it must have some mornings, she did not show it. She did everything with it she'd done before, lifted, worked, rode. Because after the first month, she started riding with me. That wasn't planned. It happened the way things happen in a working camp, out of necessity, not design. One of the hands broke his leg in November when a green horse came apart under him, and Prest was short, and Lena could ride. I mean, she could really ride, not the way some people can ride, but the way people ride who learned early and young and never thought of it as a skill because it was just the way you moved across the ground. Better than half the men in camp. Better than me some days, though I'd not have said so out loud to anyone. Prest watched her on horseback for about a week and then told her she was working for her keep until the arm was right, and then after that, if she wanted wages, he'd talk. She looked at Aldous Prest for a long moment, the way she had of looking at a person, which was fully like she was reading something written on their face, and she said, "Wages." He named a number, she said a higher number. He said something in between, she said yes. I was there for this conversation, and I watched it, and I thought, I have seen men, grown men, men who'd run their own operations, come to Aldous Prest about wages and walk away with less than they walked in wanting. She got what she asked for. I didn't say anything to her about it then. That evening she was cleaning her saddle in the tack room, which was no longer the saddle room for her but just where she slept, and I leaned in the doorway and said something I don't remember, some nothing remark about the day, and she looked up, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile but was the territory next to a smile, and she said, "You are watching me too much." I said, "Beg your pardon?" She said, "You watch me to see if I am all right. You have been doing it since the river." She wasn't unkind about it, she was just naming a thing. "I am all right," she said. I said, "I know that." She said, "Good," and went back to the saddle. That was November. December was brutal. The kind of cold that gets into the logs of a building and makes the whole structure contract and snap in the night, so you lie awake hearing the bunkhouse talk in its sleep. We had cattle to move before the deep snow locked the high pastures, and for 3 weeks Lena and I worked the same section of range, pushing stragglers down toward the winter flats. You learn a person fast working cattle. There is no room for performance out there. You find out what someone does when a steer comes hard out of the brush at the wrong angle, when the horse goes wrong under them, when it's cold enough that your hands stop working right. What they do when they're tired. How they call to the cattle, how they read terrain, how they make a decision when there's no time to think it over. You learn more about a person in 3 weeks of that work than you'd learn in a year of Sunday dinners. What I learned about Lena. She read terrain the way I'd never seen anyone read it. She could look at a hillside and tell you where the cattle would drift and why. She understood water, not just where it was, but how it moved and what it meant for the land and the animals. She'd grown up, I gathered in pieces, moving with her band through country that changed season to season, and her eye was trained to read it all as a system. When I pointed a steer one direction, she was already moving to the place she'd need to be when it turned, which it always did, and she was there. She didn't waste words. This was not unfriendliness. She talked when she talked in the way that I always thought speech was supposed to work, because there was something that needed saying, not to fill air. She'd ask me something about the country, some practical thing, and then she'd be quiet for an hour, turning it over. Then sometimes she'd come back to it, hours later, with a follow-up that told me she'd been working the whole thing out in the silence between. She told me things about herself the way you let out line on a reel, a little at a time, not all at once, and only if you didn't pull. I learned that she'd been separated from her band 2 days before the cliff. A disagreement, she said, with a short word that told me the disagreement was serious. I didn't press. I learned that she'd had a husband who died of fever 3 years before. I learned that she had a brother somewhere to the north and that she thought about him most in the mornings. I learned that she'd known the missionary woman, the one who'd given her the name Lena for 2 years, and that the woman had taught her English and she'd taught the woman Crow, and that the woman had died of fever too, and that Lena thought fever was a bad way to go, and I agreed with her on that. One night in December, camped on the east slope with the cattle settled and the fire going low, she said out of nowhere, "Why did you jump?" I knew what she meant. I said there wasn't time to think about it. She said before, "You had rope. You could have thrown the rope." I thought about that. I said, "The water was moving too fast. You'd have been pulled under before I could pull you in." She was quiet. I said, "The rope might have worked. I don't know." She said, "You don't know." I said, "No." She looked at the fire. She said, "You were afraid you'd lose me." I thought about the right answer and the wrong answer, and then I just said the true one. I said, "Yeah." She nodded like that was all right, like it was acceptable information. I didn't sleep well that night. Christmas came and went. Burl made an event of it, with dried apple pie and a jug of something that Prest pretended not to know about. And January sat down on the Wind River Range like a man who intends to stay. The snows came for real then. Real Wyoming winter, the kind that turns the world white and reduces everything to the basics of survival. Warmth, food, shelter, water that isn't frozen solid. We were cutting wood every day, hauling hay to the winter pastures, checking on the cattle through the white mornings. The work was hard and simple, and I have always been better in hard, simple work than in the parts of life that require more navigation. Lena's arm was fully healed by February. Healed as it would heal anyway. The set was what it was, and she lived with it, and she worked with it, and she did not mention it. Prest paid her wages, and she saved them, all of them as far as I could tell, in a folded cloth she kept in the pack she'd had since I pulled her out of the river, which had, by some miracle, been on her back and hadn't come loose in the water. What was in the pack she never showed me, and I never asked. In February, one of the younger hands, a boy named Gareth, 19 years old and full of the certainty that comes with being 19, said something to Lena at supper that I didn't hear clearly but heard clearly enough. Something about what Crow women were known for. Said low, like a joke that wasn't quite meant to carry, but it carried. She looked at him, just looked. The table went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something is about to happen. Gareth laughed, that laugh boys do when they're not sure they've gone too far. I was at the end of the table. I didn't look at Gareth. I looked at my plate and I said quietly, "You'll apologize to her." Gareth said, "I was just." I said, "Now with your hat off." There was a silence. I heard the bench creak as Gareth stood. I heard him take his hat off. He said something to Lena. I think he said, "Sorry, ma'am," and then he sat back down. I ate my supper. Later that night, I was at the corral checking on a mare that had been favoring her right foreleg, and I heard someone come up behind me, and I didn't turn because I knew the step. She'd developed a habit in those months of appearing when I was somewhere alone, not to say anything particular, just appearing. She stood beside me at the fence rail, and we looked at the mare for a while, and she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "I can fight my own fights." I said, "I know that too." "Then why?" I said, "Because some things don't need to be a fight, because he was wrong and I wanted him to know it." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she was done, and I started thinking about the mare's leg again. Then she said, "You are a strange man, Cal Dunmore." I said, "Probably." She said, "I don't mean it badly." I said, "I know." The mare stamped and we watched her, and after a while Lena went back to the bunkhouse, and I stayed at the fence a while longer in the cold. I need to tell you about March, because March is where things changed. A man rode in off the North Range on the 3rd day of the month. A trader, he said, name of Cutter, though I never knew if that was his given name or just what people called him. He'd been working the Crow territory to the north and was heading south to Rawlins. He stopped for the night, as travelers did. Prest was hospitable to travelers within reason. Cutter ate Burl's supper and drank his fair share of the whiskey and talked about what he'd seen up north. The way traders did, information was their trade as much as goods, and he was spending it freely. And then he looked across the table, and he saw Lena. I watched his face change. It was subtle, you had to be paying attention, but I was paying attention. He'd been looking at her the way a man looks at a woman he doesn't know, which is a certain kind of look, but then something shifted, and it became a different kind of look. A look that meant he knew something. After supper, he cornered, Prest near the barn. I was passing with an armload of firewood, and I walked slowly. What I caught was enough. There was a man to the north, Cutter was saying, asking about a Crow woman who'd gone missing in October. Husband's brother, Cutter said. The woman had taken something that wasn't hers when she left the band. I thought about the folded cloth in Lena's pack. I went back to the bunkhouse, and I knocked on the door of the tack room, which was her room, and she said, "Come in." And I came in and I closed the door and I told her what I'd heard. She listened without moving. When I was done, she sat very still for a moment, and then she reached under the bunk and pulled out the pack, and from inside the folded cloth she took out, and I don't know what I expected, money maybe, or something valuable, she took out a photograph. Small, the size of a hand, 2 people in it. A woman and a girl, maybe 12 years old. She said, "My daughter." I said, "Your." She said, "She died before my husband, fever." She said that last word the way she always said, fever, flat, with something hard underneath it. "My husband kept the photograph when she died. When he died, his brother took it. He said it belonged to the family." She put it back in the cloth and folded the cloth carefully. "It belongs to me." I sat down on the edge of the bunk, which was not a comfortable bunk, and I thought about what Cutter would tell this man to the north, and what that man would likely do with the information. I said, "How much trouble is this going to be?" She looked at me with something in her face that wasn't fear. I never saw fear in her face, not properly, but was a kind of clear-eyed reckoning. She said, "For me, much. For you, none. You don't need to be involved." I said, "I pulled you out of the river." She said, "That doesn't give you obligation forever." I said, "No, I know." I looked at the photograph in her hands. "I'm involved because I want to be." She looked at me for a long moment, that full look of hers, the one that read a thing. She said, "Why?" And I thought about the river and the cold and her fighting me with a broken arm, and the way she rode, and the way she talked, and the way she'd sat by that fire in the morning with her arm around her knees watching the hills go gold, and I said, "You know why." She looked down at the photograph. She didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and the stove ticked. Then she said quietly, "He will come." I said, "I know." She said, "There will be others with him." I said, "Probably." "You don't have to." I said, "Lena," just her name. She stopped. I said, "Let me handle this." She looked at me, that look. And then for the first time in all those months, she let it, whatever she'd been holding back, whatever caution she'd kept between herself and everything around her, she let it down just slightly, just enough. Her shoulders dropped maybe a quarter inch. Her eyes changed, not a lot, but enough. She said, "All right." 2 words, a quarter inch of the shoulders, that was all, but I understood what it cost her. I went to oldest Prest that night. Prest listened to me. He was a man who knew how to listen. He'd been in country that required it. When I was done, he pulled at his mustache and he said, "The man is within his rights to come asking." I said, "The photograph is hers." He said, "According to her." I said, "I believe her." He looked at me for a long time with that 60-year-old face that had been rained on and sun-cooked and was not easy to read. Then he said, "She's good help." I said, "Yes, she is." He said, "You feel strongly about this." I said, "I do." He was quiet, then he said, "I'll back you up to a point. You understand what I mean by to a point." I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't make me regret it." I said, "I'd do my best." The man came on the 8th of March. His name was Running Wolf, and I'll tell you that because it matters, because the names of the people in this story are not nothing. And he came with 2 others and a man I didn't know who spoke some English and some Crow, a mixed-blood trader who'd agreed to translate. They rode into the camp in the late morning, 4 horses, and Prest met them in the yard, and I stood to Prest's right and Lena was not visible, which was the plan. Running Wolf was younger than I expected. 30, maybe, hard-looking in the particular way of a man who's grown up moving through country that doesn't forgive mistakes. He wasn't unkind in his face, exactly. It was complicated looking at him. He'd lost his brother. He'd lost his niece. Whatever the argument had been, he had his own wound. The translator talked. Prest listened and answered short and translated back to me in a lower voice, and I listened to the shape of what was being said even when I couldn't get the words. What Running Wolf wanted, the woman and the photograph. What Prest said, the woman was here of her own will and could speak for herself about her plans. What Running Wolf said, the photograph was his family's. What Prest said, that was a matter between him and the woman. I watched Running Wolf during this. He was watching the camp, the bunkhouse, the barn, looking for her. He knew she was here. Prest turned to me and said, "Lo, go get her." I went to the tack room. She was standing inside, dressed and waiting, coat on, pack on her back. She'd had it ready since dawn. I said, "You don't have to come out." She said, "Yes, I do," and walked past me into the yard. The thing I want to tell you about what happened next is that I am not good with words. I've never been. I can work a piece of ground or a piece of leather or a difficult horse, and I can read the weather and I can track and I can do the 100 wordless things that ranch work asks of a man. But talk, the formal kind, the kind where you're trying to say the right thing in the right order and it matters, that's not where I live. I stood there in that yard, and I watched Lena walk up to Running Wolf and stand in front of him, and I understood almost none of what passed between them. The translator put English to some of it. Running Wolf talked for a long time, and Lena talked for a long time, and there were silences that had weight in them. And at one point, Running Wolf pointed at the pack on her back, and Lena said something that the translator said meant, "It belongs to me and to my daughter who is dead, and your brother knew that." Running Wolf was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said something, and the translator said, "He says you left." Lena said, "Yes." Translator, "He says that was not right." Lena said something. Translator, "She says she does not disagree, but the photograph is still hers." Running Wolf looked at me, not as a threat, more as a question. Who is this? What is this man to her? I met his eyes and didn't look away and didn't speak. He looked at Lena. He said something quietly. The translator said, "He wants to know if she is well." Lena looked at Running Wolf for a moment and said yes. Something happened in his face, not softness exactly, more like something laid down. He spoke again. The translator said, "He says keep the photograph." I heard Lena let out a breath. It was almost nothing, the smallest sound, but I heard it. Running Wolf said one more thing, and the translator said, "He says to tell the man who fished her out of the river that his family thanks him." I looked at Running Wolf and I put my hand to my hat brim. He did something similar with his head. Then he turned and they rode. Prest waited until they were out of sight before he said anything, which was good management. Then he said, "Well." That was all he said. Then he went inside. Lena stood in the yard with the photograph in her hand. She'd taken it out of the pack at some point during the conversation, and I hadn't noticed. And she stood there for a while in the March cold. I stood next to her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. After a while, she put the photograph back. She said, "Thank you." I said, "I didn't do anything. You did it." She said, "You stood there." I said, "That's not." She said, "Cal." She said my name the way she said everything, plainly with full attention on the word. "You stood there," she said again. It mattered. I looked out at the empty yard and the tire tracks in the mud where Running Wolf's horses had been, and I thought about what it meant to stand somewhere and have it matter, which is not a thing I'd thought much about before in relation to myself. Whether I'd mattered anywhere, whether anyone had noticed. I said, "What are you going to do now?" She said, "Stay." I said, "Here." She said, "If that's all right." I said, "Prest will." She said, "I'm not asking Prest." I looked at her. She was looking at me with those level eyes of hers, the eyes that had taken in the shelter and the fire and the splint when she woke up in the cut bank in October, that had measured everything and found it adequate. She was looking at me like that now, and what she was measuring, I understood, was me, not whether I was adequate, something past adequate. I said, "Yeah, that's all right." She nodded once. The spring came. In the Wind River Range, the spring comes slow and grudging, and then all at once, like a man who's been holding something back and finally can't. The snow went off the flats in April, and we moved cattle back to the high pastures, and the world went green in a way that always surprised me even after years of watching it, that deep cold green of a Wyoming spring. Lena stayed. She worked the same as she'd worked through the winter, harder maybe, because there was more to do. She knew the calving now, knew which cows were likely to have trouble, knew how to come in at the right moment and what to do with her hands, and Prest watched her work and didn't say much, which from Prest was the same as saying a great deal. She moved out of the tack room in May, not into the bunkhouse, that wouldn't have done, into a small room off the back of the house that had been used for storage and that Prest cleared out with a minimum of ceremony and a maximum of gruffness, which was his way of showing he'd decided something. She thanked him in the way she thanked, once directly with her eyes on his, and he waved his hand like the subject bored him and went back to his accounts. I started finding reasons to be wherever she was. That's the honest account of it. Not following, she'd told me she knew when I was doing that, but arranging things, the way you arrange things when you're not quite ready to say what you mean. Checking a fence line that needed checking on the same stretch she was working. Taking supper at the same time. Finding the same corral at the same late hour. She knew, of course she knew. One evening in June, she was sitting outside the house in the last light, mending something. She was always mending something. She found it useful to have her hands busy while she thought. And I sat down on the step below her, and we watched the light go off the mountains, which takes a while to do and is worth watching. She sewed. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The sky went from blue to green to a color that isn't quite either, and the first stars came. She said, without looking up from the mending, "Are you going to say it or not?" I said, "Say what?" She looked up at that. I said, "I know what you mean." I looked at the mountains. "I'm trying to figure out how." She said, "You don't need to figure out how, just say it." I said, "It's not that simple." She said, "It is exactly that simple." I sat there in the June evening with the stars coming in and the mountains going dark against the sky, and I thought about the river, about the cold and the rope in my hand and the jump I didn't plan. I thought about the way she fought me with a broken arm. I thought about the breakfast fire in October and the way she'd said, "You watch me to see if I am all right." About the yard in March and you stood there and it mattered. About the photograph and the daughter whose name I never learned and the weight of the things a person carries. I said, "I don't want you to go anywhere." She said, "I know." I said, "I mean, I want you here, not just working for Prest." She looked at me for a long time, that full look, reading. She said, "Cal Dunmore," quietly the way she said my whole name when she meant something by it. "I have been waiting," she said, "for months." I said, "Waiting for what?" She said, "For you to figure it out." I said, "Figure out what?" She said, "That I already am here, that I chose to be. That I chose it in October on a gravel bar when you had your arms around me and you wouldn't let go." She looked down at the mending and then back up at me. "I have been here all this time. Where did you think I was going?" I didn't have an answer to that. I sat there on that step for a while just holding what she'd said. Then she reached down and put her hand over mine, her right hand, the one on the arm that had healed crooked, And I felt the slight difference in the way it lay, the angle that wasn't quite straight, and she left it there. I turned my hand over and held hers. We sat like that while the stars came all the way in and the mountains went black, and the valley below settled into the particular quiet of a Wyoming summer night, which is deep and full of small sounds and smells of grass, and the far-off sound of cattle and wind moving through the sage. I didn't say anything else for a while. She didn't either. Eventually she said, "The coffee will have boiled dry." I said, "Probably." She said, "You should go check." I said, "Yeah." I didn't move. She didn't take her hand away. After another minute she said, with that thing in her face that was the territory next to a smile, "The coffee, Cal." I got up and I went and checked the coffee, which had indeed boiled dry. And when I came back, she'd moved to the step I'd been sitting on, and she made room for me, and I sat down beside her, and that was that. I'm an old man now. Older than 63 years felt like it would be when I was younger. My hands don't work the way they used to, and there are mornings when getting up off the bed is a project. I have been working the same country, different outfit, but the same country, that Wind River Range, for going on 30 years now, which is more of my life than I spent anywhere before, and I would not have bet on that in my 40s. You make a life in pieces without meaning to, and then one day you look at what you've got. Lena is still faster in the morning. She has been faster in the morning every morning of our married life, which is a fact I've made peace with. I wake to the fire already going and the coffee on. I come out and she's at the table with her cup and her mending or her reading. She's always been a reader, gets books from Rollins when the trader comes through. And she looks up when I come in and she looks at me the way she has looked at me for all these years, which is fully with everything in it. The gravel bar and the broken arm and the March yard and the June evening and all the seasons in between and all the ordinary days, which are most of what a life is. She looked at me like that this morning. I poured my coffee and I sat down and she looked back at her book. And I thought about a 43-year-old man standing on a riverbank in October with a rope in his hand. And I thought about the shelf of limestone crumbling and the 30-foot drop and the cold when you hit that water. And I thought about the gravel bar and the arm and the 4 days getting back through the mountains. I thought about what it means to stand somewhere and have it matter. I picked up my cup and the coffee was just right, the way she's made it for 30 years, and outside the window the morning was coming up gray and gold over the Wind River Range, and Lena turned a page without looking up, and that was the whole of it. That was the whole of what a man could want. I'm not a man who ever got the things he wanted young. What I got came late and came hard and the river was cold. But she stayed. She chose it, she said, chose it on a gravel bar in October before she could have known what she was choosing. That's the part I still think about, not what I did. What she did with a broken arm and nothing to go on, looking at a man she'd never seen before who'd just about drowned himself getting her out of the water. She looked at me and she decided. I don't know what she saw. I've asked her over the years and she always says the same thing. She says she saw someone who wouldn't let go. That's not a bad thing to be. The coffee steamed and the mountains came out of the gray and Lena turned another page, and I drank my coffee and let the morning come.